Hello, and welcome to Café New Canadians, a virtual event series that's brought to you by New Canadians. Now, New Canadians is a TV and web based show that connects newcomers to valuable information on immigration, settlement, education, employment, and entrepreneurship in Canada. So that, these are all the kind of topics that are of interest to newcomers and are of value to newcomers when they move here. Now, you can watch us on Omni TV. That's where we air our weekly episodes. You can also check out our website and view our content on our YouTube channel. For today's session, I'm your host, Shruti Dargan, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker, employment and labor lawyer, Antonio Urdaneta, who will be joining us and sharing all his wisdom and insights about this topic today, which is workplace rights and responsibilities amid COVID-19. He is, of course, an expert who will be talking about how the situation is right now, what has changed in the workplace, and what can be done to work around it. Welcome, Antonio.
Thank you, Shuri. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to help as many people as we can with information.
Thank you so much for joining us. And before we jump into talking about the session today and then discussing the topic, I'll remind our viewers that you can obviously share your questions with us. We've got Antonio who will be answering all your questions, so make them personal, ask exactly all that you need to about these concerns that you have in the workplace. And you could share your questions with us on Zoom or on YouTube, where we're also live streaming this webinar. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can post these questions in the Q&A tab. If you're joining us on YouTube, use the chat section to post your questions, and we'll try and answer them as soon as possible. So let's start the webinar. Let's start talking about the discussion. Let's discuss the topic for today, which is workplace rights and responsibilities amid COVID-19. Now, of course, Antonio, it goes without saying that, these are times of crisis, these are times of uncertainty. And in general, in the workplace, of course, it's important to be aware of your workplace rights, responsibilities. There's a lot that goes on, which one needs to be completely aware of. So before we begin that and talk about how the situation is right now, could you tell us a little in general about what are these workplace rights and responsibilities that one must know about, irrespective whether you're an employer, whether you're an employee? What is it that one must know?
Thank you, Shruti. I'll be happy to inform your audience about these important questions in these unprecedented times. But before we start, I would like to read a disclaimer that it's important for people to know that this presentation is for general guidance only, and we say this because the application of employment laws can vary widely based on the specific facts involved. And neither New Canadians TV nor myself were not giving legal advice, nor accounting, tax, or other professional advice and services beyond legal information. I wouldn't like the audience to consider this legal information session as a substitute for consultation with licensed professionals, specifically that will apply to them. So before making decisions later on or taking any action, consult a licensed legal professional. So Shruti, there are a couple of things that come to mind when these COVID-19 physical distancing thing is happening. One of them is how employers or employees are managing temporary layoffs. And the second thing, which is a second and a half, so it's like two and a half things. The second thing is preventing the COVID-19 outbreak in workplaces. It's very difficult. Together with the spread of that, you have the other side of the coin is work refusals. So we can talk about those three things as we move forward. But those three things come to mind when you ask me that question.
Sure. But in general, to begin with, what are some of these workplace rights and responsibilities that one must be aware of? And how is it? So let's suppose that, I'm someone who has recently joined a company. Now, how do I know what are my rights and what are my responsibilities? Do I get to know of them through my contract, which I have with the company, or am I informed of those in any other way? Tell us a little about that so that our viewers are able to understand, because a lot of times, of course, as an employee or as an employer, one is aware of their rights, but is there anything specific that one might just miss out on?
Right. So the employment relationships is a, I would like to think it's a very complex relationship, and you may have source of rights and duties in an employment agreement that it's in writing, or you may have rights that come from a law, like minimum standards, employment standards. You may have rights under health and safety legislation. You may have rights under the human rights legislation that are across Canada, provinces and territories. So there are many sources, but talking specifically for COVID-19, the two or three pieces of legislation that I would think about, and also another document, are Health and Safety Act. There is health and safety legislation across Canada. I'm in Ontario, and I'm talking about the examples of Ontario, but there are health and safety legislation across Canada. All the provinces and territories and the federal government have legislation for health and safety. Um, the other legislation that I think it's important is the minimum standards. It's called in some provinces like Ontario Employment Standards Act. It has other names around, but the Employment Standards Act, together with decisions from judges, will establish what the rights are around layoffs. And other source of rights and duties are the health and safety policies that the companies have to have based on the Health and Safety Act. And evidently, the employment agreement will have some sort of um, uh, rights and duties.
Yeah. So you're an employment and labor lawyer. Now, how does someone like you, what is the requirement in, say, a work setting, and how can you maybe, bridge this understanding between the employer and the employee?
Mhm.
What's your role?
So navigating, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is navigating all this legislation and putting a plan together. Some employers will be more educated about employment laws and labor laws than other employers. They may have more resources than others. So understanding this legislation, it's important for the employers and the employees, because the better they understand them and the better they apply those legislation, the employees will feel better. The employers will not have fines and other punishment that they will have for not complying with the laws. So there are many things that we could do to assist both employers and employees in workplaces to have a better work environment.
Sure. And now, of course, like we were talking earlier, COVID-19 is a situation that has just suddenly come upon all of us. This wasn't something that anybody could have expected. And in times of crisis, everything changes. These are unprecedented times in the workplace as well. Of course, work from home was an option that a lot of people had earlier in their jobs, but now it has become the new normal. So, what would you want to talk about? Like, how can you describe the situation in the workplace? Of course, you're someone who's closely related to this topic. So, what is your understanding, and what is it that you have observed in general about what has changed in the workplace?
Mhm. I think that it depends on what type of workplace we're talking about.
Yeah,
I always go back to these declare emergency provinces, territories, and the response emergency from the federal government. I always think about, is it a business that had to close? Or is it a business that it's operating because they're an essential business? Or is it a business that is in between because they were able to continue operations online through e-commerce, sell some products and services? What type of business are we talking about? So if we're talking about a business that continues to be open, business as usual, they have the higher burden to control the spread of the virus, the
yeah,
spread of COVID-19. And that's a very complicated task because it's highly contagious, because we don't have all the information that we need to make the right decisions. So it's very complicated for essential businesses to put things in place to control that spread. For other businesses that are working digitally, they have to assess privacy issues, health and safety I would stretch a little bit, but probably health and safety in the employee's house because they're working from there and that's the workplace. So probably ergonomics would be a question that they have to answer. And then with the employers who close shop, then they have to think about, am I gonna resume operations? I'm not gonna continue. What am I gonna do? And if I'm gonna resume operations, how am I gonna do that? Am I gonna call my employees back? or I'm going to send them home, part of them home. What's going to happen? So a lot of
Yes.
questions are out there that need important answers for the viability of those businesses.
Definitely. So the way I understand, of course, there are lots of outcomes of something like this, and everyone was facing a different kind of a situation. For some, it might be work from home right now. Some, of course, in the essential businesses, they still have to be there. Frontline workers, of course, have to be there. So they're constantly commuting and still going to office. There's also temporary layoff situation. There's an employment insurance. There's, different kind of settings that we have. So let's talk about layoffs. That's something that has affected, unfortunately, that is something that has become the reality for, say, a lot of people across the globe.
Mhm.
So, how has COVID 19 affected this situation in terms of layoffs? And what are the different resources available? What is it that one must know as an employee or as an employer related to that?
So that's a good question, Shruti. And I think that understanding well the difference between termination without cause and temporary layoffs is very important. Temporary layoff is not a termination. They're not firing an employee, the employer, I mean. What they're doing is to pause the employment relationship and sending the employee home while the situation gets better. So when I say the situation gets better, I'm not talking about COVID-19 specifically, but that the business had some workflow drop, and now they're picking up again what the usual workflow was. So temporary layoff is a legal tool that employers have to be able to adapt to different circumstances in the market. And it has a specific time period. It's 13 weeks in the case of Ontario. In other provinces would be something similar, maybe more weeks, maybe less weeks, but it's something similar. In Ontario, it's 13 weeks in a period of 20 weeks. There is a second type of temporary layoff, but let's stay with the basic one. 13 weeks in a period of 20 weeks. That's temporary layoff. That means that the employer needs to recall the employee before the 13-week runs out. The termination without cause is different because that ends the employment relationship, and the employer has the duty to pay the employee notice or give the notice. And it's not a punishment for the employer because the employer is terminating the employee. It is because the employer needs to give resources to the employee. In the meantime, the employee finds another job. That's the notice that we have in legislation and in common law. There are a couple of things that um, uh, caveats and nuances, but we're not going to go so deep on the termination notice. But basically, by minimum standards, the employer is supposed to give the employee a period, a time of notice period. Let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It depends on what the seniority is. And if it's not going to pay, the employer is not going to pay the notice period, it's not going to give the notice period, then needs to pay that time in money. Okay, so that's the distinction between temporary layoff and terminations without cause. The thing that we're experiencing now is that it seems that people got confused between the two, and they're using that word layoffs loosely. And now we don't know what is it that employers and employee decided to do. Do they want to come back or paid notice? So rights and duties in these circumstances are blurry so far. There are other things that you can find, like wage subsidy and work sharing programs. Those are a couple of programs that we can talk about further if people have questions about that. But instead of laying off people, the federal government, and this is not in the usual traditional employment and labor laws. This is an emergency response from the federal government that they uh, to motivate employers and employees to stay together. The federal government put in place this wage subsidy, and the work sharing program was extended. The work sharing program existed before under the Employment Insurance Act, but it was extended because of COVID-19.
Yeah. So you, of course, just explained the difference between termination without cause and temporary layoffs. We have a question related to that. Maybe now's a good time to take that.
Yes.
So Vinay Upadhyay is asking, is there any rule that organizations need to follow while deciding on termination between two employees, or is it at their own wish? Uh, do they have it at their own discretion, or if it's a non-unionized scenario?
Mhm. So the answer is it depends. I need to more facts from the situation. However, because this is legal information as a general guidance, uh, the first point is that employers can terminate an employee in Ontario and in other provinces in Canada. They're able to, and territories, they're able to terminate employees at any time. The only duty they have is to give notice or pay notice instead of that, or pay the financial component instead of giving the time. So that's the only duty they have. They can terminate an employee at any time. The circumstances that are important to understand is precisely what pop up in our screens is, are we talking about what's the reason of that, of choosing one over the other?
Yeah.
Is there a ground of the Human Rights Code that is involved? And when I say Human Rights Code Ontario, but all the provinces have human rights legislation, the territories as well, and the federal government has the Canadian Human Rights Act. So is there a ground of the code involved for the employer to choose employer with no ground of the code, as opposed to the employee with, the employee with a ground of the code, with no ground of the code against or versus an employee with ground of the code? And when I say ground of the codes are in most provinces, race, color, ancestry, place of origin, disability, marital status, family status, gender orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and so on. So is there one of those factors in the relationship, not in the relationship, but in the person who is being terminated, that the other person who the employer keeps in the payroll doesn't have? And that's a question to that we need to ask. So as long as that is not involved in the choosing one employee over the other, if we're talking about performance, if we're talking about sales, if we're talking about seniority, education, those things are okay. An employer can choose because of those reasons one employee over the other.
Yes. So actually, there was another question that came up about human rights code, but you've actually you answered it way before that. Another question that we have here is from Aditi Kashyap, which is, so termination without cause can be on any grounds, or this is a question that can it be on any grounds, including say lack of available business?
Yes. So termination without cause could be for any reason, as long as it's not discriminatory, it's not reprisal, like punishment against the employee. It could be for business reason. It could be that the yeah, it could be absolutely any reason that it's not discrimination or reprisal.
So while we're on this topic of discussing, say, termination, and like I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, this is the reality that's facing a lot of people. A lot of people are in difficult situations because of this. What other challenges related to termination are people facing? Or would you want to share some anecdotes from the clients and the customers that you deal with, where there has been, say, a wrongful termination, stating something else, but it is actually something else, or how people this often happens. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly because we can't prove it, but a lot of people feels that, well, some group of people is using this opportunity to just do things that otherwise they wouldn't be doing. The thing is that there are many choices out there at this moment, and employers need to make decisions strategically. So when I say many choices out there is temporary layoff, leave of absence. There are a couple of new leave of absence related to COVID-19 that employers can use and employees can use. Um, uh, Wrongful terminations, constructive dismissals, wage subsidies, work sharing programs, Canadian emergency response benefit. So there are many choices at this moment, and employers, I think, are struggling with choosing the right ones for their viability. So good faith, thinking about that. Well, it's just the circumstances that we're experiencing that are unprecedented. I think that it's a matter of just pausing for a second and thinking, what are the things that we need to put in place so we can continue working together, or if we can continue working together, we choose the right tool. So when I say that is, well, I need to terminate this employee because we can continue working. We're not gonna have it back the same way it was before. So we're gonna terminate the employee. Well, terminate the employee if that's what you need to do. Don't discriminate. Don't punish employees. Just terminate it because if it's a business decision, but comply with the law when you do that, right?
Yeah. So would it help if we could distinguish exactly on what grounds is it okay for an employer to terminate an employee's contract, and what does not make sense at all, that this is definitely, this qualifies as a wrongful termination? Could you maybe just list it out a little more for the viewers to
Um,
understand?
I think that it will be case by case, but the things that you could understand that may be a reason for terminating a group of employees under these circumstances is, well, I had 10 offices before COVID-19, and I was struggling already with those 10 offices, and I didn't know what to do before COVID-19. Then COVID-19 hit, and I had to close because I'm not an essential business. I had to close 10 offices, send every employee back home for a while. Then the government says, well, I have this wage subsidy now. I'm going to give it to the employers so they can give it to their employees. I call back all these employees, but I don't have the resources to keep the 10 offices open. So that employer could say, well, I'm going to keep only five. And all these five offices, I'm going to close them down, and I'm not going to keep the employees, and I'm going to terminate those employees. That seems reasonable. It's unfortunate, but that seems reasonable under the law. A different thing would be that you have those 10 offices, and the employers starts choosing from all the offices the people that they think they want and they think they're better, and then they pull from those 10 offices and build just three new offices with the people that they think are the ones that they want, and then they get rid of everybody else. That will be a little bit different, right? But yeah, again, it's case by case, that we need to assess it. I don't know if that answers your question, Shruti.
That does, definitely. And now looking at from the other side, one often hears from friends within family, you hear of people who have been laid off. And that just makes the employer look like the bad person here, the villain, right? It's not easy for small businesses to this situation right now, these times right now, for employers who really want to care for they do care for their employees right now, but they're also stuck in a situation wherein it's difficult for them to move on as usual, continue as usual, in times that they were continuing before, say, COVID-19. Let's talk about that a little to also sensitize people with this phenomenon that, I mean, it's not easy for small businesses too. And of course, employers don't have another way a lot of times. So, what are the challenges that employers are facing
Mhm.
that justifies this move on their part?
Evidently the workflow and cash flow of the business. So if we're talking about a business that had to close uh, altogether, right? So close the door, just wait until they say you can open again. Those type of business, they we're talking about small businesses here. So they all their life depend, like everybody else, on that business. If they don't produce money, they're not going to pay their mortgage. They're going to struggle with buying food like everybody else. They're going to struggle, right? So they're facing, in a human level, the same thing that an employee is facing, right? Now, they also have the struggle of having in mind, well, I want to keep my employees, but I can't, right? I've been working with 10 people for 5 years, for 10 years. I've been working with this group for a long period of time, and they're part of my life, and I don't want to get rid of them, right? But I can't, right? So they're struggling to find these solutions as well. I mean, not everybody's like that. Probably there are bad apples everywhere, but most employers, I believe, especially small businesses, um, who are a lot in Canada, they're struggling a lot as well.
Yeah. And as I can see in the Q&A tab, of course, we've got lots of questions coming in. I'll move on to the next one very soon.
Yes.
This is again a reminder: everyone who has questions, don't shy, don't shy away from it. Keep sharing them. Also, because these are situations that are so similar for, say, a lot of people, it would help if the viewers, if there's a question that you see over here posted by somebody else that is relevant to your situation as well, and you would definitely need an answer to that, you can obviously choose this option of upvoting that question. That would give us a signal that, you know, this is a question that is of high importance to a lot of people, and we'll definitely answer that first. So as we move on to the next one, there's a question by Aditi Kashyap. She's asking, can temporary layoff be used multiple times during the year, even if I've already laid off employees for 13 weeks?
Hmm. So the short answer is yes, it could be used multiple times during the year. But so the first layoff, the general one, is in Ontario, and there are other, it's different weeks. There are different weeks across provinces and territories. But the example that I have from Ontario is 13 weeks over a period of 20 weeks, or 35 weeks over a period of 52 weeks. The difference between the 35 weeks as opposed to the 13 weeks is that for the 35 weeks, the employer is keeping, for example, they continue to pay benefits. Okay. So if they're not going to continue paying benefits, for example, then they cannot use that 35 weeks layoff in a period of 1 year. The only thing that they have is 13 weeks in a period of 20 weeks. So after that 13 weeks, over a period of 20 weeks, the employer cannot lay off an employee again until the new year comes into
Yes.
place, right?
Yes, definitely. So before we move on now to, say, more question related, I'm guessing that, you know, this is a hot topic. Of course, there'll be more coming in. I saw the slide also had something about wage subsidy. Now, you mentioned that briefly. Maybe now is a good time to talk about it in detail. Tell us, how does that work? How can one use
Mhm. So the wage subsidy, again, it's a federal program. It's part of the emergency response, and I have a couple of websites that I would like to share with you before we go. The wage subsidy started on April 27th. So the government has started to accept applications for the wage subsidy on April 27th. And the wage subsidy is evidently a subsidy from the federal government to the employer to pay the employees up to 75% of the salary of that employee. It has a limit. It has a limit of about 800 and something per week,
it?
dollars per week, right? So it has a limit, anyways. But it's 75% of of that person's pay, and the federal government asks employers, those who were able to continue, so to top up the payment up to 100%, to pay the remaining 25%. Some employers said, well, I'm going to pay 5% because I'm able to pay a top up of 5%. So that's what the wage subsidy was. And the intention behind these 75% is that employers call back the employees for everybody to be in the payroll, keep the employment relationship open, and people were not applying to Canada Emergency Response Benefit because everybody turned to that program. So it was complicated for the government, I think, to manage that, and financially it was going to be very heavy for our system. But so call back the employees, 75% at least and the employees would have gotten um, more than what they would have gotten from employment insurance, for example, or in some cases from CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefits. So it's basically a subsidy from the government up to 75%.
I get that. And what about work sharing program? That's also a solution that works both in favor of employees and employers. How can both parties benefit from it?
That's my favorite one. I think that it's the strategically speaking is the more oriented to the long run and to keep the employment relationship alive and to keep skills alive. So I mean the employees' skills up to date. The work sharing program, it existed before. What the emergency response did was that they extended the initial period of from 30 something weeks to 70 something weeks. So now the program lasts more than a year. And the basically is that all employees, because there is less work, all that the company, the employer has less work, all the employees are going to share the hours necessary to complete that work. So let's say that you have 10 employees, 40 hours a week, that's 400 hours, but there is no job work for everybody. So instead of laying off half of the employees, right, what they do is that they reduce the hours for everybody. Everybody has some hours a week, let's say 200 altogether, but all of them will have, if we're talking about 10 employees, all of them will have 20 hours a week. And the employees are able to apply, will be able to apply for employment insurance to top up to a certain extent the financial burden that they're having now because they have less hours of work. In the meantime, the employer will be able to recuperate the regular operations, go back to the regular operations, and that will be post COVID-19, evidently in these circumstances. So it's basically a way of keeping employees working so they can keep the skills up to date, not losing the skills. They don't have to be laid off, and the company will continue working. The government would not have applications for employment insurance of 100%, but less. So it seems to be a win-win-win, employee, employer, and government. The application is a little bit complex, but I think that it's worth it.
Definitely. Thank you. I mean, I can see that, these are these questions that are coming up are customized to their needs right now. And these are concerns that they have, and you're answering them live for them. So thank you on their behalf to you.
Thank you,
Another
Shruti.
question here. So Mehmood Ismail is asking us that I understand temporary layoff can be converted to termination after the 13 weeks. What if the what is the employee right in this case?
Yeah. So if after 13 weeks the employee is not called back, what happens is that the termination would be considered that it happened from the moment that the layoff started. But the employer will have to pay the notice and will have to pay whether to pay the notice or to call back the employee for a period of time so the employee could finish the notice period.
Yes. And I mean, I'm sorry if I'm just shooting questions one after the other to you, but your face tells me that you're enjoying it. So
Uh,
I'll
well,
continue doing it.
I'm like a dog in a pond. So you can see me calm up on top, but my feet are just moving fast below the surface.
But definitely, it's great advice, and it's of course helping people. The next one here is from Taivo Julius, who is asking that what is the best course of action if an employee gets a new employment offer and has resigned his current job, but the new company now takes back the offer, cancels it.
Mhm. I think that we're getting into terms of contract,
Yes.
breach of contract, right? So in this case, it's a little bit outside of what we're speaking today, but yeah, it's basically reviewing the employment agreement. What are we talking about? When was the start date? And what is the reason why the employer just stopped the beginning of this contract? So it's a tricky situation. But a little bit outside of what we're talking about today. But yeah, it's a contract question.
Now, taking a break from these questions and going back to another concern during COVID-19 and workplaces is that hesitation that an employee might have in times like these to actually go to the workplace. Now this is about your personal well-being. This is about your mental health at this point, and I remember in our discussion earlier, you mentioned the right to refuse, the right to participate. Tell us a little about that, and from these different interactions that you had with your clients and customers, what is the scenario like right now?
Mhm.
Is there
For
that hesitation that I'm talking about? Is it there?
Yes, totally. And there are a few examples happening across the country with businesses having to shut down because there was a new outbreak of COVID-19 in the workplace, and they just have to close for 14 days. But yes, that fear is out there. Um, Talking about the legal part of it, um, So health and safety legislation tells employees that they have the right to know what the risks in the workplace are, hazards, the dangers in the workplace are. They have the right to participate by giving ideas and opinions about how to control these hazards in the workplace. And they have another important right, which is the right to refuse to perform part or all of the work. But that refusal doesn't mean that it's a blanket rule for employees to say, I'm not going to work, and that's that, right? It's not like that. So the work refusal, the right to refuse to perform part or all of the work, um, it's going to be investigated. The employee needs to participate that is refusing to do the work for some reason, in this case, COVID-19. And then the employer needs to investigate, employer and the joint health and safety committee, which we can talk about exactly in the third point there, or the health and safety representative will have to investigate and then make a decision whether that refusal was reasonable, or on the contrary, the employee needs to return to work, or to perform the work that refused to do. It is a situation based on COVID-19. It is understandable why an employee, a worker would say, listen, it's not about me, it's about my family. I have kids, or I have an elderly family member at home, and they are, I mean, if they get COVID, it's going to be very difficult for them. I don't know what would happen. So these fears are real, but the law says, and again, this is a decision for everybody to prioritize based on what they need and their circumstances. But the law says, if your employer, I mean, it doesn't say that, I'm paraphrasing, but if your employer is doing everything the employer has to do to prevent, doesn't need to that it's going to stop, but to prevent the spread of an infectious disease, which is what COVID is, highly infectious
Yep.
disease, um, and you still refuse to work, maybe there could be discipline against you, subject to a collective agreement, subject to the joint health and safety committee, and so on. There may be discipline against you, and maybe your employer will consider that refusal, continue to refuse after they told you to return, as a job abandonment, which will carry the termination. It's not even a termination, it's that the employee saying, I don't want to continue with this contract. The best way to handle that is to have a joint health and safety committee, to have a representative if it's a smaller company, and let them review the refusal and then make a decision.
Yes. And so, you've of course talked about the right to know, participate, and refuse, and the sentiment that people have right now, the fear that people have right now. We've also been, for a while now, answering questions related to termination, related to contracts. I'll go back to one question that we recently attempted, which was about, one company has given you an offer letter, you've resigned from your previous one, and now the next offer that you had is also gone. In this present COVID-19 situation, if such a thing were to happen to someone, what's the way out?
The way out for the employer, for the employee.
Both, because we've got, I think, both sections joining us today.
I mean, the employers, not the employer. If the employee resigned to the first company, then that company and that relationship is over. There's not much to do there. There may be some circumstances where I would explore a little bit more, but I won't go deep on that alternative, because I don't think that's the question. Um, I mean, the question, I don't think that goes that way, but if I'm not answering the question, please let me know. Um, with the new company is exposing to a breach of contract liability and damages caused. So that's a lawsuit, and I invite these participant to audience to um, contact a lawyer or contact the law society of the province where you are, and ask for a lawyer or a paralegal who can review the contract and give a specific legal advice. But the new company is exposing itself to a breach of contract, and the employee So the employee, I understand that there is a financial burden that the employees is having now because doesn't have the income from the previous employer and doesn't have the income from the new employer, but probably doesn't qualify for the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit because he didn't lose the job because of COVID-19. He or she resigned, right? So it's a tricky situation, but I would contact the Service Canada and ask them what to do because it seems unfair if the new employer. So, for example, I would say, and please contact Service Canada Employment Insurance to understand what's going on. But I would say that if the new employer cannot perform the contract because of COVID, I would argue that you're not having a job because of COVID-19. Therefore, Canada Emergency Revenue Response Benefit may apply. But I'm not sure. Before you apply, it's better that you contact Service Canada and figure out whether you could do so.
Yes. And, while we were talking earlier, you mentioned that, this is a good faith versus bad faith kind of a situation, of course. Some people are following the rules and guidelines, some people are misusing it. There's nothing that can be done about it. In your opinion, what is the extent to which people are, say, functioning in bad faith as well right now?
Mhm. It's difficult to tell.
Of course, I mean, it's hard to put statistics to it,
I
but
would say
yeah.
discriminate. Sorry to interrupt, Shruti. I would say I would pay attention to uh, grounds of the code, discrimination, people with disability, uh, and other grounds of the code, family status, and so on. I would pay attention to those circumstances within a decision from an employer to terminate the relationship, not to call back the employee, but call back others, right? I would pay attention to those. In the case of labor, I would be close to the union, those who are unionized, and making sure to be together, facing the next steps that everybody will need to take.
And of course, I can see over here that this 13-week of temporary layoffs is something that people are most curious about. There's another question related to that, which is that what happens? So here's a situation that if somebody is laid off temporarily, and after that period, the employee realizes that they have been replaced by somebody else now. The company decided to hire somebody else, and to the previous employee who was temporarily laid off, now a termination letter has been sent.
Mhm.
That's also a tricky situation. How can one navigate that?
So again, if the employer decides to terminate this employee who was laid off and bring another one, I will make sure to review discrimination situation if there's a circumstance that needs to be explored.
Yep.
And second of all, did the employer give you notice or pay instead of notice? And that goes with the Employment Standards Act or common law. It depends on what the agreement says, the employment agreement says or doesn't say. But the best thing that because I don't know, so we're not giving specific advice. Participants can call the Ministry of Labor. They have a hotline for employees and workers, and also have a hotline for employers. But employees and workers who have this question about layoff and how the employer is handling that, call the Ministry of Labor in the province or territory where you are and ask the question directly with your specific circumstances.
Thank you. That's great advice, of course. I was just about to ask you that, if there are any resources or where can one check more about their specific situations. And you've shared that once again before I could even ask that. Now, related to work, of course, and health conditions right now, we'll talk about the Joint Health and Safety Committee as well. Here's a question which is related to the health conditions. Let's try and tackle that first. This is from Emiliano. I hope I'm getting the name right here. The question is, what are the rights for employees with a health condition that is considered high risk if they get infected with COVID-19? Can the employee refuse to go back to the physical office? And can the employer require the employee to be at the office in this even after such a concern? And assuming that the employee is enabled to work from home. So just to break it down, employee wants to work from home because they're in a high risk health situation, and but the employer still expects them to come to work.
So I don't like this question. Let's move. No, I'm kidding. This is a very difficult question because um, underlying conditions underlying conditions is not something that an employer has to accommodate based on human rights legislation. So underlying, this is my opinion, and I've been arguing with my colleagues. They say that yes, it is, but I say, well, no, because it's not a disability. It's an underlying condition, but it's not a disability. So technically speaking, it doesn't have to be accommodated. That's my opinion. And when I say accommodated, it's adjusted for the employee to work from home or to work in a different location, or not to expose him or herself to the workplace somehow, right? Or stop working altogether. But it is advisable for the employers to be reasonable in this situation because the liability is very high. If an employee comes to them and say, I have underlying conditions, you know what those are. I am able to work from home. I would be the only one working from home. And the employer says, well, I don't want to open those floodgates, and something bad happens to that person, then the employer is going to be exposed to damages because of what happened to that person, right? So it's better to be a little bit reasonable and flexible in these circumstances, but I'm not saying that an employer has to accommodate based on the legislation, but it's wise to accept certain circumstances in during COVID-19.
Of course. And like you mentioned earlier, for all of these cases, these are individual cases, and there's a lot more than just what we see on the surface. So it must be consulted with a legal expert before one takes a decision on something like this. Now,
At least directly, yes.
yes, and because we were discussing health here, is this the concerns that you just answered? Is this where the Joint Health and Safety Committee comes into play, or?
Yes. So one of the duties of the Joint Health and Safety Committee for those companies who have to have a Joint Health and Safety Committee, not every company, it depends on this, how many employees they have that they actually, when they hit, I believe 20 employees in Ontario and other provinces similar, they have to have a Joint Health and Safety Committee that includes employer management and employees. One of the jobs that they have is to assess work refusals. So when an employee says, look, I'm not going to work because it's dangerous and I think that it's reasonable, then the Joint Health and Safety Committee makes the decision whether that was reasonable or not. But in the case that it is reasonable, then the Joint Health and Safety Committee says, well, we're going to recommend the employer to fix whatever was dangerous. And then you come back to work.
Yes. And what about, say, employment insurance? Now that's another concern that people have. That's another method right now that is in play. A question related to that over here is, how does employment insurance work in Canada? Is a payment made from the employee's monthly salary to the central fund, which can be availed as a periodic payment at a time when laid off?
Mhm. So employment insurance in Canada, it's paid by both the employee and the employer. Both of them have to pay, so the employer premiums and employee premiums as well. It is centralized in the federal government. It's a federal legislation, and it varies from province to province and probably from city to city, from industry to industry, from right because they have all these numbers going up and down, and they establish how much, and that varies over year. They change how much an employee in a particular area, in a particular industry, will be entitled to if they need to get employment insurance. So it's a complicated system, but it's available online and open for everybody to see. Um, right now, the first benefit is the employment insurance basic for everybody is 55% of the salary if you apply for that. I believe it's 55% of your salary. So if you go, you're terminated without cause or laid off, and the layoff became more than 13 weeks, then you apply for employment insurance and would be probably 55% of your salary. I believe is that, but it's available online.
Sure. And A lot of people watching our show, whether Café New Canadians or New Canadians in general, a lot of the population out of that is newcomers. So, what are the resources and newcomers being in the country who may have just recently got a job or are still looking for employment, but now they're stuck in a situation wherein they don't know whether they qualify for CERB, whether if they had a job and they willingly quit it, or if they were laid off, different situations.
Mhm.
Are there some resources that you would recommend in such a case, or where can one go for legal support?
Right.
Now,
So
before you answer, I'm so sorry to cut you off here, but of course, you did mention a few resources, and we'll make sure that if there's anything else also that you would want us to collate, we'll put all of that together. And in the communication, this is for the viewers as well, that you don't have to worry about if you missed out on the resource that Antonio has shared with us over here. We'll definitely put the list together and share it with you in the communication that we have with you after the webinar as well. But coming back to the question, what's the legal support that's there for newcomers?
perfect, Shruti. And thank you for mentioning that you will send information later. I will give you 5 or 6 links that I prepare for your audience. That includes who are essential businesses, Public Health Canada and Public Health Ontario. Those are information that we need to pay attention to. Um, the Law Society, in this case of Ontario, but every law society has a website in Canada, and others that are I think are relevant at this point for people to have in their favorites, so they can go and check those links. Probably on a daily basis will be great. Um, so resources out there for legal representation, for example, the first thing that people should go to is Law Society of the province. There are legal clinics as well. But let me go back to law societies. So the law societies, at least the one in Ontario, probably the others will have something similar. The Law Society in Ontario has a program where they refer first time caller or a person who contacts for the first time the Law Society to a lawyer or a paralegal for a 30 minutes free consultation. So if you're in Ontario or your situation is related to Ontario, just go to the Law Society website of Ontario and contact the Law Society, because they would refer your case to a lawyer or paralegal who is in that program for a 30 minutes free consultation. On top of that, there are legal clinics across the province, across the city. I'm not sure that all the provinces have legal clinics systems, but if they're like Ontario, you will have legal clinics for different languages, legal clinics for different areas of law. And it would be, and on top of the legal clinics, you will have Legal Aid Ontario. Legal Aid Ontario is for those people who qualify, who don't have an income over a certain amount a year. They will qualify to receive a legal aid certificate, which will allow you to hire a lawyer, and legal aid would pay the lawyer for a period of time.
Sorry, I
Sorry,
was on
Shruti.
mute.
Yes.
Yeah, I was on mute. Now, addressing all of these concerns, of course, not all hope is lost. There are still, I understand that there is laying off, there is this temporary, um, I mean, people are being laid off, there are businesses that are shutting down, but then there is still jobs available. There is still some hope out there in terms of essential businesses. What opportunities do you think exist right now, and where do you see it going from now?
So I think that there will be a lot of movement in the job market, because employers and employees, what we talked at the beginning, they had to react to this situation and were laid off, and now you have people in their homes and employers trying to resume work. So there is an opportunity to take new jobs from all this movement. So if you're closer to an industry or an employee, and the ones that employer had before are not that close, or had another job, have another job now an opportunity opens up. One of the resources that I would share with you, Shuri, is the Essential Businesses link. Uh, under the declare emergency of every province in Ontario, sorry, every province in Canada, um, the essential businesses list will be expanded or reduced. And I say expanded or reduced is because we're now expanding that list. So a couple of weeks ago, you had 16 sectors. But if you look at the essential business list today, it has 18 sectors. So it's going to continue expanding if the spread of the virus is controlled. But if it's not controlled and we go the wrong way, hopefully not, then that essential businesses will be reduced. My point with this is when the um, governments of each province expand that list, you know that businesses are going to reopen in the new ones. So those ones are going to be whether recalling employees or hiring new employees because they have to deliver their services. So I would pay attention to that. I wouldn't disregard non-essential businesses with digital and remote work. So people in the IT industry, for example, will be probably having a lot of business now because companies need to adapt to an e-commerce environment. They're having more orders online and they don't know what to do with that. So there are many things that in the IT world can develop in the non-essential businesses with digital remote work and in the essential business as well. And again, these expansion of as we move forward and governments relax physical distancing as much as they can, and it doesn't, we don't have another outbreak, hopefully not, more businesses are going to reopen. And there are particular sectors that are more vulnerable than others. I put a list here, but I will share with you, Shruti, the finance department of Canada, where they have all the programs available for pretty much everybody in Canada. So it includes, for example, programs for assisting hiring or creating more jobs for youth, post-secondary students, and recent graduates. Another that pops up is international students working in essential services. I was reading that today, and in the website it said that what the government is doing is uh, for international students, they had a limit per week that they could work 20 hours. Now they don't have that limit. So they could work more than 20 hours as long as they are in the essential services environment. Um, yeah, so there are opportunities out there. Don't get discouraged. Look for the information is there. I know it's a lot of information. I know it's a lot of information, believe me. And I like to read for my job. I read all the time, and I know that there's a lot of information out there. But don't get discouraged. Try to get these information right, and there are sources out there that you can use.
Thank you so much for that. You're over and over telling our audience right now over here that you will be sharing the resources, and definitely we've promised that, and we will do that in the communication that follows. Let's take another question related to termination, and I know that we don't have too much time left, and definitely we'll try answering questions. If there's anything that we've left out over here right now, we'll get this question to you. You could answer it, and we'll share it again in the following communication. For now, this one is from Harpreet. This is: if an employee is laid off at 5 months without any notice before their 6 month probation ends, and termination offer is handed over with no negotiation offer considered, what should be the course of action?
So the termination was given before the termination period ended.
Before the probation period ended. So if it's a 6 month probation, but the termination was at 5 months, and it was handed over without any negotiation that was done. So what is the course of action for this person?
Well, there's no if the probationary period was in the employment agreement and it was before the probationary period ended, and we're not talking about discriminatory reasons, the employer can terminate the relationship. I mean, I would like to see more context about that, but like the other question we had before, probably in this situation, you would like to consult whether a lawyer or a paralegal and see if there is something else like, I don't know, maybe there could be. But for what I'm hearing, the employer can terminate an employee at any time. This was a probationary period. There was a contract, and the employment relationship was ended before the probationary period, and the employer doesn't
Yes.
have to renegotiate that termination.
Yeah. It was a permanent employment. So the if it's a permanent employment with a probation period of 6 months and somebody was laid off before that, then what would be the course of action? I understand
Um,
that these are, of course, personal and customized
Situations,
questions,
right?
and yeah.
But the same answer. So even if it was a permanent position, there was a probationary period, and what I understand is that the person was terminated, not temporary layoff, but terminated before the probationary period ended. Is the same answer. An employer can terminate an employee at any time within the probationary period. They don't have to give notice, and that ends the relationship, subject to other circumstances that may be happening in this situation. And I encourage this person to at least contact the law society of the province of where that person is or territory.
For sure. Briefly, we can possibly try and take in another question here,
Yes.
which is so what kind of support is available? What kind of support is government providing to new permanent residents who have landed here? So, we were discussing the situation of newcomers. People who have landed over here, it's hard to get a job because of COVID-19. And what are the options available? And CERB doesn't apply, CERB doesn't apply in this case because they just came and they haven't lost a job in Canada. So, specifically for someone who's in Ontario, what is the kind of support available?
So again, in these resources that I will share with you, you will see in the specifically for the Department of Finance of Canada, you will see the list of help for individuals. And I mean, the first thing that I think about is food, right? So there are the food banks were expanded, and libraries are being used to deliver food as well. So that's the first thing that I think about when I'm in well, reacting to these unprecedented circumstances. So are we gonna have food? Pretty much. And then I can't think about other assistance, emergency response benefits that the government put in the list, but you will see that it is an extensive list. So the idea is to go through these lists and see what is for you, what is there for you. Because I could say, well, for me, serve, right? But for others would be, where can I find the food bank and who can help me with my rent, for example.
Yes, of course. And I think there's only so much that we could have answered, but of course we haven't concluded because what's the way forward now? We can't end the session before having a sense of understanding from you right now that, where do you see this going? Of course, we're in these crisis situations right now. There's so much happening. You've answered so many situations that people are in, so many concerns that people have had, and we've been answering them for a while now. Where do you see this going? And specifically related to this 13-week termination as well, do you see, I mean, a lot of businesses might not be able to actually, bounce back in, say, so much period. So, what's the way forward in general? And with regard to this, what can one expect?
So in general, I would say from an economy point of view is that at some point, whether in months or in a year or so, we will get back to some sort of normal. I would like to take with me from these times the good things, like what we're doing today, right? I would like to keep these practices because these makes us better professionals, connect us better and with more people. So it's great. I would like to keep these type of practices when we go back to normal. But my point is that we are going to get back to some sort of normal, and as long the time will pass, and we're going to get a better understanding of what's going on, and we're going to make better decisions. So better decisions of, well, what is the type of personal protective equipment that we need. Now we're controlling outbreaks better. Perhaps we have a vaccine. So we're going to get to that point. It's just a matter of time. And in this situation, everybody's anxious, everybody is stressed. I understand, depressed. I understand, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. and we're going to have two different worlds now of work. So I don't think that we're going to shut down the economy, but actually this is going to, hopefully, and this is an aspiration, hopefully the economy will um, grow into two different environments, one fully digital, one fully physical, and a mix of all of that. So we're going to have more opportunities rather than less. And one thing that I like to say to my friends, to my family, is that I'm very proud to be living in Canada during COVID-19, because I'm confident that the people who is making decisions at this point, they're making the best decision they can within the circumstances. So I trust them. I mean, things could be done better, but all of them, all the provinces, all territories, and the federal government, I think that they're doing the best they can to control the spread of the virus in Canada.
Definitely. I couldn't agree with you more over here. And but before we come to an end, I mean, we've of course discussed a lot of topics today and answered as many questions as we could. Is there anything from your end, a message that you have, or any advice that you'd like to repeat for the viewers before we close?
I would say a couple of things. One, in the human aspect of it, keep going, look for the information. There are good resources out there. It's just a matter of finding them. And in the technical piece of it, don't take every word for granted and whatever they're saying as it is the truth. There are many things happening out there, and there's a lot of information going on out there. So try to find the right source. I'm talking about temporary layoffs. I'm talking about health and safety issues, work refusals, and things like that. Try to find the right source that can give you the right information that you need.
Thank you once again to you, Antonio, for joining us today, for sharing your insights. It's been a great session. And of course, thank you to the viewers who stuck around with us, even though we've gone a slightly ahead of the time that we had planned. And as mentioned earlier and as promised, we will definitely be sharing all the resources that you mentioned over here in our future communications. On your screens right now, you have the contact details for Antonio if there's anything that you'd like to get in touch for. You have the details right here. We'll also be sharing it later. And of course, this session of Café New Canadians, like many others, has been brought to you by New Canadians. And we've got lots more in store for you. For New Canadians, please stay connected with us on social media as well. That's where you'll know about everything, the latest bits of information that we're putting out, the content that we put out. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Telegram, all of these platforms. We're there on that. Another way to stay in touch with us would be if you subscribe to our newsletter. I would highly encourage that. And that's a way that you can get all of this information, our latest content, right there in your inbox every month. Of course, before you sign out today, I would request for you to take just a minute and answer this quick survey that we have for you. This would help us perform better the next time, help us understand that, how could we perform better? What is it we got right or wrong? And of course, your feedback will be highly, highly valuable to us. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got more sessions coming up for you. The next one is on May 21st, another session of Café New Canadians. This one would be about the mindset shift that every newcomer needs in Canada. These are testing times, and there's a lot that one can learn. We've got more exciting sessions planned for you, just like the one we had today with Antonio. So thank you once again to you, and thank you to your viewers. Everyone, please do stay home and stay safe right now. Thanks, Antonio.